Welcome back, Sebastian here. So time for my power rankings for the 2024 United States Grand Prix. Very, very exciting Grand Prix this morning. Definitely, I think the lead was pretty much decided, but that being said, we had some very good battles throughout the field, from the battle for that final spot on the podium between Verstappen and Norris, for some of the fights for the lower points, especially, for example, Lawson coming through the field. So a lot of interesting talking points from this weekend's Grand Prix. And again, let's get started. So today will be the debut of the new magnets. For some of if you have been watching some of the videos I did during the fall break, you will see them. Don't need a pen. Now I can just put these magnets on the board, and you guys don't have to read my terrible handwriting. But starting with number 20, and I think there's not going to be a ton of debate. I think you could debate, quite a few of the drivers on the bottom, but I think for the most part, people will understand that they're there. So I think number 20, I'm going to put Zhou Guanyu. So for Zhou, sprint qualifying, qualified 20th, finished 19th in the sprint, only finished ahead of his teammate because his teammate's brakes caught fire. Then in main qualifying, qualified dead last. Started a little bit higher because of penalties for other drivers and other drivers starting in the pit lane. And then in the race finished P19. Qualifying wasn't as bad as it usually is for Zhou. But that being said, it was a pretty poor weekend all around. And again, had a bit of a unnecessary, unforced error when he spun at turn 1 in the early part of the race. Number 19, another driver who I think had a bit of a disappointing weekend. Not like Zhou in the sense that, for Zhou driving a Sauber, there's expectations aren't that high. But this is a guy who's driving for a team who I think the expectations were much higher, and that is Alex Albon. So for Albon, a bit of a clumsy spin in sprint qualifying that made it so that he had to start at the back. Ended up starting from the pit lane, I think, because they changed parts on the car. Sprint didn't go so well, finished 19th, and then the main Grand Prix did out-qualify his teammate Colapinto, but only by about 1/100th of a second. Then in the race, had a bit of a dive bomb at turn 1, spun Ocon around. I think he was a bit fortunate not to get a penalty for that, but he definitely did pick up damage for it. So yeah, not a great Grand Prix for Albon. Number 18. Number 18, oh dear, that's not how that's supposed to go. Number 18, let's see, there we can go. Number 18, Yuki Tsunoda. So for Tsunoda, very similar to Albon, a young rookie teammate in his first basically partial season, I guess, of F1. I guess Lawson, he was there last year as well, and again, this year it's also a partial season. But for Tsunoda, a bit of an up and down weekend. So for Tsunoda, in the sprint qualifying, qualified 13th, and then ended up, actually no, is that for the wrong driver? Sprint qualifying, qualified 9th. So actually qualifying went pretty well for Tsunoda in the sprint. Then finished 11th, a couple positions outside the points, maybe a bit unfortunate not to pick up any points. And then in main qualifying, qualified 10th. And then basically, comparing him and Lawson, him and his teammate Lawson in qualifying isn't really possible or fair, given Lawson was serving that grid penalty. So Lawson, for example, didn't set a time in Q2. So if you just look at the Q1 times, technically Tsunoda got out-qualified by 4.5 tenths. But again, not really a big deal. And again, that does not influence Tsunoda's spot here. Tsunoda's Grand Prix wasn't so good. Started 13th on the road. And then basically he got that 5-second penalty for forcing a driver off. Obviously, I think he was a bit unfortunate with how the strategy played out as well. But he also then had that clumsy spin at turn 1, very similar to Zhou. And I think those two things kind of together is why I've decided to put Tsunoda towards the bottom of the board. Without the spin, I think he would have been, several positions higher, easily third row. Number 17, I'm going to go with Lance Stroll. So for Stroll, not a great weekend, but that being said, it was a pretty average weekend by Stroll standards. I think he was out-qualified by Alonso by about 0.3 of a second in the main qualifying session. In the sprint, qualified 13th. Didn't set a time in Q2 because of his track limits deletion. Finished 13th in the sprint, and then in the Grand Prix, finished in 15th place. So again, pretty mediocre weekend for Stroll, but that being said, I think the car was pretty poor, and I don't think points were really on the cards, especially if you look at where Alonso finished as well. Number 16, I think it was a pretty disappointing weekend for this driver. I'm just going to see if I can fit, so we can get the magnet up there. Oh, there we go. Just get that magnet in. Okay, number 16, Sergio Perez. So for Perez, another pretty disappointing weekend for the Mexican driver. Sprint qualifying, qualified 11th, ended up finishing 9th in the sprint, didn't get any points there. In the main Grand Prix, technically qualified 9th, didn't set a lap, or qualified 10th, started 9th, didn't get a lap in Q3 because one for track limit deletion, one because of the George Russell crash. But yeah, out-qualified by 4.5 tenths, so not great for Perez there. And then in the race, just wasn't able to make up positions very early, really struggled to overtake Colapinto, struggled to overtake Tsunoda as well. Did eventually get past them through some clever strategy on the Red Bull pit wall, but still was overtaken by Russell in a slower Mercedes, in a Mercedes that started from the pit lane and also had a 5-second penalty. So I think all in all, poor race from Perez. I think he also finished about 40 seconds behind his teammate. So yeah, race pace as well, not great for the Mexican driver, and really hurting Red Bull in the Constructors' Championship, as they're, I think, less than 10 points or about 10 points ahead of Ferrari, and that's a gap that could be easily covered in a single weekend. So moving on to the third row, and number 15. Number 15, a driver who had a very disappointing weekend. Some of it his fault, some of it not his fault, but that is Lewis Hamilton. So for Hamilton, he had the sprint portion of his weekend was actually much better than the main Grand Prix portion. And that's kind of what's saving him from being right at the bottom. But for Hamilton, he qualified 7th in the sprint qualifying, moved up one position, finishing 6th in the sprint. And then in the main Grand Prix, that's kind of where things kind of fell to pieces. He apparently picked up damage in the sprint, so the mechanics had to repair parts of his car for qualifying. Not sure if that made things worse or if it didn't completely fix whatever was wrong with it. But the end result was that Hamilton got out-qualified by, 6 tenths of a second by his teammate George Russell, and qualified 19th on the grid, behind drivers like Bottas, behind Colapinto, behind Albon, all drivers in much slower cars. So qualifying was a massive disappointment, and then in the Grand Prix, of course, crashed 3 laps in at the exact same corner where Russell did as well. In fact, that both of them crashed, and that you have Toto Wolff coming out afterwards saying, oh, it was the car's fault, not the driver's. I'm being a little bit more generous for both drivers for that crash, for their crashes there. But I think all in all, unfortunately for Hamilton, he didn't really have a whole bunch of any really bright spots for this weekend that could potentially move him further up. So I've decided to put him in 15th. Number 14, I'm going to put Esteban Ocon. For Ocon, not a great weekend. Sprint qualifying, qualified 17th, finished 17th in the sprint, and then in the main qualifying session, qualified 12th. Out-qualified by his teammate Pierre Gasly by about 4 tenths of a second. So again, pretty big qualifying gap. Never really looked to be challenging for points, and ended up finishing 18th, although to be fair, a lot of that was because of the damage that he picked up on the first corner after the contact with Albon. So I'm not particularly being too harsh on Ocon for that, but again, not a whole lot of pace, speed, and performance in the rest of the weekend. Number 13, I'm going to go with Fernando Alonso. For Alonso, not a great weekend. Pace was really nowhere, particularly in the races. Qualifying at points was okay. Sprint qualifying didn't set a lap in sprint qualifying 2 because of track limits. So started 14th and then ended up in 18th. So yeah, a real shocker in the sprint, going completely backwards and finished behind Stroll there. But in the main Grand Prix, qualified 7th. I think that's realistically the best he could have done. Out-qualified his teammate Stroll by 3 tenths of a second, but just kind of fell backwards in pace and ended up finishing 13th on the road, pretty far outside of the points. So moving up to 12th, and I'm going to go with Oscar Piastri. So for Piastri, one of his most disappointing weekends of the season. And just in terms of qualifying gap to his teammate Norris, this was actually the biggest gap of the season. So for Piastri, he in the sprint qualifying, of course, qualified 16th because of track limits, deleting his fastest lap in sprint qualifying 1. Recovered to 10th, which I think was realistically the best he could have done given how few laps there are. Main qualifying was much better, but still not great. Qualified 5th and was out-qualified by his teammate Norris by 0.6 of a second. In the main Grand Prix, he just kind of ran his own race. Never really looked to challenge for any of the podium positions. And yeah, just kind of came home to a solid 5th place finish. So number 11, I'm gonna go with, let's see, here we go. I'm gonna go with Valtteri Bottas. So for Bottas, even though on paper the results didn't look great, the reality is I think he really got the most out of the car and didn't really do anything wrong. So for Bottas, he qualified 19th in sprint qualifying, but was somewhat close to some of the other cars around him. I think also out-qualified Joe by a pretty big margin as well. Finished last in the sprint because his brake caught fire. Qualified 18th for the main Grand Prix, but started in 16th and then ended up finishing in 17th, which I think is realistically the best that the car could have done with where it is right now. Early on in the race, he was up in 15th, which, given how bad Sauber's been recently, is pretty high. So yeah, I think for Bottas, I think he was about average, did about what he could be expected to do. So again, 11th is about average when you have 20 drivers on the grid. So that's why I decided to put him there. Now moving into the top 10, this is I think where we're going to have a bit more debate. So number 10, I'm going to go with Pierre Gasly. So for Gasly, really up and down weekend. So for Gasly, the sprint portion of the weekend didn't go so well. Qualified in 12th, finished the sprint in 14th, not particularly great results there. But in the main qualifying session had an excellent result, qualified P7 and then was promoted to P6 with Russell starting from the pit lane. Best of the rest in qualifying there, so really good job there. I think really unfortunate in the race that the strategy that he and Tsunoda didn't really work out. Again, you can see one driver's in 10th and one driver's in 18th, but there were some differences. Both of them picked up 5-second penalties, but of course Tsunoda had that very costly spin, and for Gasly, he had that really strong performance in qualifying in an Alpine, which I think on balance is still not a great car. So I think it was a really, really good result for him. Of course, yeah, picked up the 5-second penalty, but was overtaken by Colapinto, so he wouldn't have finished in the points anyway. Ends up finishing in 12th. Just outside the points, perhaps with a better strategy, could have finished in the points. But all in all, I think that being said, I think a little bit of misfortune for Gasly, but I still think it was a pretty good weekend for the French driver. Number 9, I'm going to go with Franco Colapinto. So for Colapinto, pretty strong weekend again in Formula One, impressing many around the paddock in his 4th weekend at the top level of single-seater motorsport. But sprint portion of the weekend was kind of up and down. So sprint qualifying, qualified 10th, so a really impressive result there. Did fall backwards to 12th, so unfortunately not able to pick up points in the sprint. Then in the main qualifying, qualified 17th, I believe, started in 15th. So again, was out-qualified by his teammate Albon, which is why he's not higher on the board. Again, did have a little bit of a mistake in his last lap in Q1. I think what we saw in the race from Colapinto showed that Williams had really good pace. So I do think that Colapinto didn't get the most out of the car on Saturday in qualifying. But that being said, the race had an excellent race. Got his way, started on the hard tire, switched to the mediums, and I think that turned out to actually be the best strategy in the race. And there's another driver, at least one more driver who hasn't shown up on the board yet, who also used that same strategies. But for Colapinto, again, came home 10th, got another valuable point for Williams, and it might help when in their battle against Alpine for 8th in the Constructors' Championship. Number 8, I'm going to go with Liam Lawson. So for Lawson, the sprint portion of his weekend wasn't so great, which is again why I don't have him higher up on my board. For Lawson, qualified 15th in the sprint qualifying and then ended up in 16th. So again, not great results and behind Tsunoda in both occasions. But main qualifying, he technically out-qualified his teammate Tsunoda by about 0.4 of a second, showed really strong pace, but unfortunately because of the engine penalty, he only set a time in Q1, so didn't set a time into Q2 even though he advanced. And then in the Grand Prix, starting from 19th on the grid, starting on the hard tires, really strong pace. A bit opportunistic at the start with kind of the chaos at turn 1 between Albon and Ocon. Gained a whole bunch of positions, got up to I think P14 just from that, and then picked off a couple more positions. From there, some good overtakes on Alonso, for example, and then that allowed him to just kind of run his own race and pick up a couple of really decent points for RB. So I've decided to put Lawson in 8th. Number 7. I was going back and forth on the drivers in 6th and 7th, but 7th I'm going to go with Lando Norris. For Norris, I think he has the qualifying speed. The qualifying speed is definitely not an issue, as he has the second most pole positions of any driver in F1 this season. The race starts continue to be an issue. He had pole position again, and again on the opening lap of a Grand Prix starting from pole, he lost positions. Didn't really close the inside properly, allowed Max Verstappen to be very aggressive, go for that move into turn 1, and that unfortunately cost Norris quite a bit. I don't think, if things go completely perfectly for Norris, maybe he splits the Ferraris. I don't think he was ever going to get Leclerc though. But this was a really important weekend where he needed to take points off of Max Verstappen, and he was not able to do so. In the sprint again, he didn't have a great sprint. Qualified 4th, finished 3rd, and again probably could have qualified a little bit higher, and again lost points to Verstappen there. And then in the battle with Verstappen later on in the race, again didn't really make the most of the fresh tires when he came up right to the back of Verstappen. Took quite a while. Did eventually get passed, but unfortunately was given a 5-second penalty for that move. So for Norris, while some parts of the weekend were very good, there are also a lot of parts I think if he wants to win this championship, he really needs to kind of work on and try to solidify in these final 5 races. All right, number 6, the last driver on this row is George Russell. So for Russell, really up and down weekend. Sprint qualifying very good. Qualified P2, very close to getting a pole position for the sprint, but suffered with tire issues, so fell down to 5th. But that being said, I think the sprint was okay. Then in the main qualifying session, qualified 6th, of course, but had that heavy crash. Again, this is kind of what I mentioned when I put Hamilton 15th, if only one of the Mercedes drivers had that crash, and again, if we didn't have those comments from Toto Wolff, I think both drivers, they would have been lower. But it seems like for whatever reason, the Mercedes upgrades that they brought this weekend have some big issues, and particularly in that really high speed turn 19. So I'm being a lot more forgiving with Russell's crash in qualifying because of that, which of course forced him to start from the pit lane. For Russell though, the recovery drive was very strong. Got past Perez as well, despite picking up that 5-second penalty. And I think for a lot of the drivers, the 5-second penalties they picked up were, I'm not going to say unfair, but it felt like the drivers didn't really know what was a penalty and what was not a penalty. So that's why we saw so many of them come out in the race today. But that being said, really strong drive from Russell, so I decided to put him in 6th. So moving into the top row, let's see. I think I'll just keep going as it is. So number 5, the first of our 2 Haas drivers, you'll notice that neither of them have shown up yet, but the first of the 2 drivers, I'm going to put Nico Hülkenberg. And just to keep things simple, I'm going to put his teammate up next. Turns out that I decided to put them 4th and 5th. So that way I can just talk about them together. So for the 2 Haas drivers, Hülkenberg and Magnussen, really strong drives this weekend again. It could be that the car is just having a big upturn in form due to upgrades, or it's just a track specific thing that makes it so that the car is actually much stronger than we think it is. But for Hülkenberg and Magnussen, I thought they both did a really good job. So for Hülkenberg, sprint qualified in 6th, but made a bit of a mistake at the start, which made him fall down the order. He was able to recover as a P8, so did still pick up a point in the sprint. Main qualifying session, made a mistake in Q2, definitely should have gotten into Q3, but didn't really seem to hurt the end result for him, as he did finish in P8, which was best of the rest. For Magnussen in 4th, sprint qualified 8th, and then finished 7th in the sprint, so a really good result in the sprint, getting a pair of points there. In the main qualifying session, qualified 8th, out-qualified his teammate by 700ths of a second, and was one of those drivers who, if we'd been able to have 2 laps in Q3, would have been really interesting to see what he could have done on his second flying lap. Then in the Grand Prix, was running well, running in the points, but suddenly, for whatever reason, fairly late in the Grand Prix, was called into the pits. We don't have an official reason at this point, but given my assumption is that it's probably going to be some kind of puncture or some kind of critical issue. But whatever it was, it really ruined his strategy, and it made it so that he finished in, let's see, what was it, 11th place, one spot outside the point. So unfortunate result for Magnussen, but that being said, I still think the performance from Magnussen this weekend was very, very strong. Now, into the top 3 we go. At number 3, I'm going to go with Carlos Sainz. So for Sainz, sprint portion of the weekend went very, very well. Qualified 5th, moved up to 2nd, so good job there. In the main Grand Prix, qualified 3rd, out-qualifying his teammate by, let's see, what is it? 900ths of a second. And then the main Grand Prix, strong pace at the start, was P3 for the first stint, then undercut Verstappen and moved up to P2, and very strong pace, was all pretty much equal, if not a little bit quicker than his teammate Charles Leclerc in the second stint of the race. So all in all, really good result for the Spaniard. Now, 1 and 2, we of course have 2 drivers left, Verstappen and Leclerc. I'm actually going to put Charles Leclerc second, and I'm going to put Max Verstappen in first. So for Leclerc's, the sprint portion of the weekend wasn't so strong. Qualified 3rd, finished 4th, so again finished behind his teammate in the sprint, and then out-qualified by his teammate for the main portion of the Grand Prix as well. But that being said, had an excellent start, went from 4th to 1st, and then just kind of drove away from everyone there. But that being said, for Max Verstappen, I thought he had an absolutely fantastic weekend and was the best driver on the grid this weekend, which is of course why I have him first in my power rankings. Without the sprint portion of the weekend, I think things become much tighter between himself and Leclerc as to who deserves that number 1 spot. But for Verstappen, took pole for the sprint and then won that sprint in pretty comfortable fashion. Qualifying very, very close to taking pole, but was only P2. Out-qualified his teammate by a comfortable margin. So I think in qualifying, Verstappen, basically for the first 3 sessions, Verstappen basically maximized his results, and of course was very, very close to taking pole, if not for the yellow flags from Russell's crash. In the Grand Prix, I think was very aggressive at the start, doing what he had to do to try to get past Norris. He was able to do that. Of course, lost position to Leclerc. I don't think he ever really had the race pace to keep Leclerc behind, so even if he took the lead at the start, I think Leclerc still would have passed him pretty comfortably. Again, lost a pit stop to Sainz. A bit more debatable about whether or not he would have been able to keep that, but if he pits right after Sainz does, perhaps he's not able to defend from Norris later on. So it's kind of, again, one of those chicken and egg things that we're never really sure, we'll never really know. I thought did a very, very smart job of defending Norris. Maybe went a little bit over the line at points, but I think given that he didn't get a penalty, I think did things within the rule, within the letter of, within the rules basically, as they've been written for this year. So there you go. There's my power rankings for the 2024 US Grand Prix. Let me know your thoughts below. Who did you think were the best drivers? Who do you think were perhaps not the best drivers? And again, part 1 of a triple header complete. So I'll be back with my preview on Thursday, and hopefully there'll be less tech issues than there were in last week's. I've been doing some troubleshooting, trying to figure out what exactly is the issue and where things can get fixed. So hopefully things should be a bit better this time around. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.